Hello, everybody. This is Philip speaking to you from northern Thailand, and I'd like to welcome you to a brand new podcast series, and this is the first in my series. This podcast series is called Education and Spirituality Matters, and I can't think of two finer gentlemen to join me for my first podcast. And we've got Stephen now, Cnudde or Nuddle?
Cnudde.
Nuddle. And Nigel Utton. I only call people by their first names, and CN. We're going to have a nice little chat about education and spirituality for about an hour. It would be nice to let these two gentlemen introduce themselves, but I'll just say a quick word about what I know. I met Nigel 2 years ago and Stephen probably a year ago. I don't know how long, Stephen, but we all regularly talk on the education pillar of the World Freedom Alliance, and Nigel is one of the head honchos, as I understand it, of the World Freedom Alliance, and we talk about and are trying to bring an updated, upgraded, better education system to everybody. So I think that will probably form the basis of the chat. So hello to you both, Nigel and Stephen. Thank you for coming.
Hi. Very welcome.
Now, Nigel, I know, obviously, I think you're osteopath or chiropractor? Osteopath.
Well, that's interesting. I'm not allowed to call myself an osteopath anymore. I have a first-class master's degree in osteopathy, but I've taken myself off the register. So to give myself more freedom to practice the way I want to. So, but I am qualified as an osteopath, yes.
Because of
course, fortunately, I was a head teacher of a primary school. Decided to pack that all in about 8 years ago now, and retrain. So 2 careers so far.
Well, we will get some stories out of you as being a head teacher, because there's no doubt in my mind from our 2 years of knowing each other that you were an exemplary, proper head teacher, and it must be very hard work for head teachers and teachers everywhere in the system in the UK. I assume it's the same in Belgium, Stephen. I know you. I can't remember if you work within the system or outside the system. Perhaps you could just let us all know what you teach and where you work.
Well, I've been studying, investigating myself for how the best way should be for real education to bring forth what is within the child. I've worked in private schools, I've worked in startups, I've worked in the main system which we experienced as a child. So I've done a lot of things from Waldorf to Cnudde to private funded schools. And I have a lot of expertise, and I yesterday launched my own online course where I just gathered and assembled everything I have learned and experienced, also the challenges, which I think most people should be aware of if they start a new kind of organization or system. And so I'm at this very moment working part-time in one of the schools I've co-founded in Belgium with a great team, but I also have my own little company with my wife in which we give our own trainings. And besides mathematics, I was a math teacher for a long time. I also had a training in voice liberation, the power of the voice, and then I combined it with the power of the heart, and I give workshops and trainings in that also.
Voice liberation. Can you say what that is? I'm assuming it. I'd like to know exactly what it is. That sounds very good.
For me, it's understanding the real tool we have as voice. With our voice, we can create vibrations, and so we can ask for things, or we can order things, or we can just create like singers do. So it has a lot of aspects, but it also has an energetic aspect. Like a baby, it can make sound for 10, 12 hours a day and not be exhausted. And that also is a part of my training. How can you use your voice so it gives you energy, which was very important for myself as a teacher, because before I had the training, I was exhausted if I had to teach 6 hours a day. And now the more I teach, the more I speak, the more energy I have. So it's also this aspect of how does this voice from within, and according to the geometry of the body, how can you use it so it gives you energy and also gives you more self-confidence and more resilience in life?
Wow, interesting. It's something that you've made me think here is that I've got no problem at all teaching in the classroom. I've conducted workshops for 100 people. I was speaking to, I don't know, 250 people at my mum's memorial service many years ago. No problem at all public speaking, which most people freak out on. But if you asked me to sing to any of those groups, I would probably curl up and die. And I've been thinking about this because I've been thinking about how you break through your reservations or your self-consciousness in whatever areas you are. Does this, have you got any tips, or does that not really apply? I mean, how can I suddenly sing and not be worried how I'm going to sound? Because I don't think about how I sound when I'm speaking, but to sing, even here, would be a horrible idea.
Well, it is a very broad aspect or region to discuss. We had a talk with the World Freedom Alliance on this aspect alone for an hour, so I don't know if you want to dive in it at this very call, because it has a lot to do with self-confidence, daring to speak, daring to let your inner world hear on the outside. So it has a lot to do with being authentic and not being afraid of what the others will say or think about you. So it's really, it has a great aspect of, I have to search for the English word now, surrendering to your own voice.
Yeah.
In our training, one of the sentences I really remember well was, you are not singing, it is singing. And with it, they meant life is singing through you.
Yes.
Which is for me like the same, it has a lot of resemblance with what we experience if we have a meeting with our 3 or more at this weekly meetings, where we just respect the flow of life that wants to speak through us. But if you combine it with singing, it reaches more vibrational settings, because the speaking voice is like the middle part of the piano. With singing, you also go to the lower tones and to the higher tones. So you broaden the variety of frequencies. And with this, you also, because singing has a lot of melody in it, you also make more inner movement in your system, which involves also more emotional involvement than with the speaking voice.
Okay, nice. Okay, well, moving on from that a little bit, you mentioned 2 things that I find essential in education for students. And I think that most students and children and typical school systems can't find these. You talked about self-confidence to speak and daring to speak. So Nigel, self-confidence and daring to speak. If you go back to your days as a head teacher, did you ever give training, or did you have meetings with your teachers about how to get children in the classroom to dare to speak and without being put down by teachers, and to, obviously, when we speak, that's when we gain self-confidence, and on the flip side, when we don't speak, we will struggle to have self-confidence because we're not expressing ourselves. So is that something that you focused on when you were a head teacher?
Very much so, actually. We introduced something called philosophy for children in both of my schools. I was head teacher at 2. And people think that philosophy for children is teaching them about Aristotle and Sophocles and things like that. It isn't. It's teaching them the philosophical method. And inquiry. How do we inquire? So our curriculum, our whole curriculum actually was geared around philosophy for children. And so that I would usually do an assembly on a Monday morning for the whole school, and the children would then go back to class and they would discuss that in a circle within their classroom and discuss the issues that I'd raised in my assembly. So one of my favorite ones was it was just a video of a little seal on an ice floe, and just the seal was just moving around in the sea, and then gradually you saw that the sea was moving a bit more forcefully, and then a bit more forcefully, and then you realized that there was something underneath this ice floe, and you could then eventually you realize there were killer whales that were trying to knock the seal off the ice floe. Seal fell in the water, and then the video ended. And then I said, right, kids, go back to class, discuss that as a philosophical inquiry. And oh, wow, the discussions that they had. We didn't teach the children to speak. We gave them opportunities where they would have the opportunity to speak and voice their feelings, voice their thoughts. And what we found with those philosophical inquiries, the children would think about it all week. And they would come up to me and say, that was terrible, you showed us the seal being killed. And then this other child would leap in and say, no, but the killer whales have to live too. They have to eat something as well. And then they would have these wonderful discussions about it. And so, yes, I think, and one of the things about philosophical inquiry is that there are rules around how you treat each other within that environment. So you're allowed to have different views. So people were allowed to defend the whales, they were allowed to defend the seals, and they got on to talk about all sorts of other things, sort of like human beings kill the whales, human beings kill the seals, and they have to defend their position, but without being rude to each other, without arguing with each other. Just they have to get very, very good at thinking, well, why do I think this? Is there another way of looking at it? So I loved what Stephen said earlier on about the idea of the singing voice comes through us. And what that reminded me of is I gave an interview the other day about, and I was being asked about being an osteopath and spiritual healer. Because for me, when I treat somebody, it's not me that's treating them. The treatment comes through me. I get this definite sense that, I mean, I'm happy with the word God. God works through my hands and does the healing for me. And the person's body either receives that healing or it doesn't receive that healing for some reason. And I think that's in terms of education and spirituality, it's not about teaching them about it. It's about allowing it to flow through you and allowing them then to receive that flow of energy and bring it back to us. Because I'm sure all of you find that we learn from our students all the time because there is a flow between us. It's not a one-way street. And I think that's where a lot of education goes wrong. It's that the teacher thinks they're the expert and they're inculcating knowledge into little beings that haven't got any, and that absolutely isn't the case.
With in these chats in the classrooms with the children in a circle, what role was the teacher playing? Because obviously, if the children are going to speak, they have to feel, in other words, they, you know, to do that, they're in a classroom where the learning environment is emotionally supportive for them, and that for me goes against what's typical in school systems, where it's not. In fact, it's actively discouraged because often children who ask questions are often end up being labelled troublemakers, which is crazy. So how was it that your teachers were in that position to encourage this chat?
Philosophy for Children has very, I'm going to say strict rules. I don't like strict rules, but there are very strict. There's a form, there's a holding form around the whole process, and the teacher is the facilitator. Usually, it doesn't have to be the teacher, because one of the students could be the facilitators and follow the rules. And the first thing that happens in the circle is that something is passed around the circle, and you can only speak if you are holding, whether it's the talking stick or whatever it is. And if you don't want to speak, and I think this is crucial, if you have nothing to say, you pass it on. And there's no shame in that. There's no pressure on you to say anything at all. Because I think that's important, because I think in a lot of teaching situations I see where teachers pounce on a child and demand that they give the answer to a question. I mean, I know myself, if someone suddenly pounces on me and says, right, what do you know about? Boom, my head freezes, probably because of my experience of school, actually. my head freezes and I can't get the words out. Now, the person then thinks I don't know the answer, whereas I probably do, but I need a little bit of time to think about it and to retrieve those memories and not do it under a position of pressure as well, because the pressure can shut down our thinking.
Yeah, definitely. Does that resonate with you, Stephen, in your experiences in the classroom?
Yes, totally. I would just add, we all three, we know we believe in a lot more freedom for students and teachers. So the flow of what really wants to happen in the room can reveal itself. But like in this philosophy circles Nigel talked about, or the circles we have at school, this very clear border or setting, it doesn't limit the freedom, it just gives an opportunity to reveal itself, because we all need, like in a game, we need to know in which environment and in which setting we meet each other, so we can truly engage in the same game, let's say. So I believe in very clear, strict, let's say, playing rules. Like for a circle, you have someone who guides it, you have a talking stick, nobody else is speaking besides the one who is holding the instrument. It can be in stone or something else. It creates these very clear rules. They create a safety environment in which everybody can just go into relaxation, because they also all know they get a chance to speak. So it's not a competition to be the first one or to be the loudest one. So I think the rules we need should support safety, relaxation, and engagement. And from that on, you can enter an empty space where life just wants to speak through us and wants to connect us also through our voice, because with a voice we communicate with each other and we can reach out to each other.
I think what you've both hit upon there is so important for everybody, and it's true for spiritual living as well. Everything is that you've both talked about strict rules, but these strict rules enable freedom and energy to flow. So I've always thought that freedom carries boundaries. Freedom without boundaries goes against the law of nature. Everything in nature has boundaries, but it also has the connection, which is the interesting thing. It makes me think about the rules. When I teach my teacher students, one of the classes in the course Classroom Inquiry, and one of the classes we discuss group dynamics and so on, and we talk about rules. And everybody thinks, oh yeah, schools have rules and teachers have rules and authority has rules and so on. But I used to tell my teacher students, there's two rules about rules. Number one, don't have any rules that you can't abide by, and don't have any rules that you can't enforce. So there's usually dozens of rules everywhere, and they're up on the walls and everything. But I said, don't have rules for discipline. Have rules that promote and enhance the learning experience. And when that happens, all the students, children or adults, they realize that these rules are to help the whole group succeed. And if the group succeeds, the individuals succeed, and if the individuals succeed, the group succeeds. So rules are really important. And and just to finish off on what you've both said with the questions to the students, in my time as a teacher trainer, I've observed dozens and dozens of teachers, and I've heard all my teacher students tell me, well, you know, when I ask questions, then nobody answers. And what the teacher's doing is just asking a question to the whole group, and they don't want to talk because, as you said, Nigel, maybe they need time to think about it. They don't want to have the wrong answer and all sorts of things. So, you know, in task-based learning, which I use, and I'm sure that you've both used, I have the students in small groups. So, you know, they get the questions, or they add their own questions, write their own questions, and then they work in small groups. And now they have time to talk together without speaking in front of the whole class. And then when we come back after the group work as a whole class, everybody's ready to talk. And then at the end of all of this, they actually go, hang on a minute, we haven't heard what Philip's got to say about it. So yeah, I think summing that up, I think rules are essential, and a good reason for the rules. And the last thing I'd say about rules is that I don't know what age children you teach, Stephen, and what age you can do this, but what age can children contribute to the rules? You know, I mean, I used to get some of my students to, you know, I give them 3 rules. You know, don't be late, do your homework because it's part of the next lesson, and sit in a different seat. And then I said, we need 2 more rules. So I want you as a class to formulate 2 more rules. And so then they had co-ownership of the rules. And this was another cementing factor that meant they owned the classroom themselves, and therefore motivational levels were much higher. Now, I don't work with children, you both do. If you said to the new class, look, I've got 3 rules for you, class, and I need you to come up with 2 more rules, what kind of age group of children could start doing that?
I'd say any age. I worked in primary schools. I would do that with 4-year-olds.
4-year-olds?
Our 4-year-olds would have been able to cope with that. And because we did the philosophical inquiry with 4-year-olds as well, they get brilliant at it. Wow. They really understand because I was going to say, in my school, one of the first things I did when I was a head teacher the second time, I got rid of all school rules. There weren't any school rules. When I arrived there, children had to walk on the left-hand side of the corridor. They had to walk in silence to assemblies. They had to line up. They weren't allowed here. They weren't allowed there. It's just a whole list of rules. I mean, it's just absolutely insane. It reminds me of that Harry Potter film where the new head teacher comes and she puts all the rules up on the wall. So I got rid of rules, and what we had was school values. And the school values we all came up with as a community, and that was the pupils, the teachers, the parents. In England we have school governors, and we got together in groups and said, look, what do we value in this school? And it spelt out the word checker. I probably can't remember what they all stand for now, but it was cooperation, honesty, excellence. Another C, a K, kindness, another E, and then R was respect at the end. And what we then had, we had a flow of consequences. So if you were respectful, there'd be a whole load of things that would happen. So it would be a list of things, again, that the children and we all came up with. So what should happen if you're respectful in class? Well, the teacher should thank you for that. Perhaps other students should thank you. Perhaps you should get a letter home to your parents if it's something that you weren't very good at. Letter home to your parents saying, thank you for being so respectful in class today. What do we do if you're not being respectful? Well, you need to be told that you're not being respectful. You need that pointed out to you. Well, what if you're disrespectful again? Well, you tell us what should happen. And the children came up with all these wonderful rules. The children were usually much stricter than we were. Well, they should be kicked out of the school if they're not respectful. What, just for one time? Or so it was consequence. It was called consequences, and the children responded brilliantly. And they would often, if they'd been involved in a big fight or bullying or something like that, and I would say to them, well, was that respectful? It's one of our values is respect. And the child would say no. And I say, well, in what way was it not respectful? And they say, because I hurt this person, I hurt their feelings, I physically hurt them. And then they'd usually say, but they physically hurt me first. And so I'd turn to the other person and say, was what you did respectful? And we would have a intelligent discussion. Just imagine if the politicians of the world could manage this. Unfortunately, they can't, but children can. And I would then say to the children, well, what consequence do you need to encourage you not to do that again? And they would tell me, I think you should write to my mum and tell her that I've been really bad. and so I say, well, what should I say in the letter? And they would tell me. And it was beautiful. They had ownership of their own behaviour, and it empowered them as well, to, rather than me just saying, you're a bad human being, go back home, you're not allowed to come to school for a week. It would be a discussion between the two of us of what should happen and why. And would their behaviour be different when they came back afterwards? Are they still going to punch people and kick people and bite people? And well, if you are, then you're going to find yourself in this loop again. So that needs to change. And it was so powerful.
And did they
Really,
come
really.
back and bite people, or were they now changed?
I actually had in one of the schools I worked in before I was a head teacher. I was in charge of a behavior unit with some of the most damaged students around. And it was a mainstream school, so it wasn't a special school for children with behavior difficulty or anything. It was a mainstream school. And some of those children absolutely turned their behavior around, others didn't. It was, I didn't have enough control over the whole system to be able to really influence. When I was a head teacher, I could do that much better. And there was only ever one child in that situation who was so damaged by what had happened to him before in his childhood that he ended up probably in a secure unit, I think, because he could not control his behavior, his violent outbursts. But most children responded absolutely fantastically and changed the way they were behaving. But it came from them. It didn't come because I was bullying them or shouting at them or screaming at them or forcing them to do it. It came from their internal, the word was locus of control was within them. They were choosing to behave in a more human way.
Now, you're talking about children here. This suggests very strongly that human beings have an innate sense of what is right to do, and that if they are in an environment where they're allowed to tune in and express that innate sense, then it seems that that there's only pluses that come out of it. And obviously, if somebody strays, that's the whole point of being a child. You get guidance from whoever the group leader is. What you've just described and what you've been describing as well, Stephen, is it's a red herring, it's a red flag word, but is for me. It underscores what good leadership is. And for me, the leadership is not to lead anybody. It's to unblock all the blockages in the environment and allow other people to be their best. That, to me, is all that the leader should be doing. And everything that they do is designed for this in mind, that I want my students to enjoy the lesson. I always used, every time I planned a lesson, my whole focus was, if at the end of the lesson the students have had fun and the 3 hours, because they were usually 3-hour lessons, if the time shot through, then I've been successful, and that was it. So whatever I did was aimed at doing that. Stephen, did you want to say a word on my definition of leadership there? Because just for all the viewers around the world, we've talked about leadership before, and there's never been any true discussion in society that I'm aware of what leadership is. Whether we should have it and what makes it good or bad. But the way I define that, Stephen, would you accept that therefore you need some kind of leadership to enable that environment? Because, sorry, just to say, Nigel, you said also that if you'd been the head teacher, you'd have had more control over allowing that good thing to happen. So it seems to me that leadership does have a role to play if it's the right kind and has the right intention and objective behind it. Would you agree with that, Stephen, or disagree, or what?
No, I'm very a little bit surprised that Nigel talked about 4 years old who already had the capability of defining good values, which resonates with what I believe in my heart, but I have never worked with 4 years old, so I didn't know that. Because I in the school I co-founded now, with my students, we wrote like the same kind of text, I think. So I sent them all out and I asked them, okay, what do you need to be able to study and to feel welcome and safe in this school? And I all sent them out, and then we had a circle meeting, and then one would give one of his values or needs to the group. And then I asked, okay, who resonates with this one? Who has something which connects with this sentence or this need or this value? And then we made kind of summary, and we ended up with, I think, 8 sentences, which embodied all the needs and all the values they brought, but they were only 7 students. And the next year we did it again, and we came to, I think, about 20, 25 sentences, which embodied everything. And then it has remained the same for the next years. So I believe the children, this co-ownership of the setting of the environment, I think that is one of the most important changes we can make as a society. So where not one leader sets the rules and the values or the consequences, but the leader does what you described, Philip. And I think the leader is more like a role than a responsibility. I think responsibility lies with everybody who is a member of the group, but the leader has a role because he has this capacity, like managers have in a firm. I'm not a good manager. They like to structure, they like to get things very focused and clear for everybody. They like to cut the dirt away. That's a kind of being, or it also has to do with the talents you have as a human. And I think some people are designed to fulfill more of the leading role because that's what they are wired to do. And besides that, we also have this evolvement of the brain and of the meta-cognitive thinking capabilities, which evolve with the growing of your brain, with the development of your brain. So I think it's more a role and a responsibility to take up this role, but then a co-ownership with the group than the kind of leadership we have seen in the world. In most worlds, I think.
The kind of leadership we've seen in the world, well, does that not reflect the typical classroom in our school systems, where the teacher is the external authority? Is that not the root cause of all our world's problems, that children typically grow up not in the kind of classrooms you two have been describing, but in classrooms where the teacher, they're discouraged from speaking? So are not the problems we see in the world reflecting the schooling that went on before?
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. And the school systems around the world have been designed to hold the political and economic systems in place.
Mm.
If I think back to my schools, they were benevolent dictatorships.
Mm.
I grew up in a benevolent dictatorship where we kind of trusted that these adults had our best interest at heart. And I learned very early on that some of them absolutely did not. Some of them did, some of them didn't. And that was actually quite a useful lesson to kind of put in a little bit of mistrust there of people in authority. But I think for the majority of people, I mean, what I saw in education, certainly in the UK, is that it became more and more authoritarian the longer I was in education. That when I was in education in the 60s, 70s, 80s, there was a move away from authoritarian teaching, and child-centered education was promoted as the way forward. Mm. That very, very rapidly got knocked on the head and ended up being, the policy was called no excuses. So there was a no excuses policy, which kind of came, I think it was from America, where the child basically just had to follow the rules unquestioningly. Mm. And there was if they were told to do their homework by a particular time on a particular day, they had to do it, and if they didn't, they would be punished. There would be some sanction against them. If they'd been involved in a car accident and their mother and father had been killed and their brother and sister were maimed, that was not an excuse. You were told to do your homework, you must do it. And there are examples as bad as that, where children were told, no, there's no excuses, you must do what we tell you to do. And that's what we've seen happen more and more politically around the world as well, that we are being turned into little automata that have to obey all the rules, and if we don't, we're going to be severely punished. And the governments don't have to do very much because it's already been instilled in us in the school systems. Mm. So we've been hypnotized into that following the rules. Professor De Smet from Belgium, I think. Is he Belgian or is he? Yeah, I think he is Belgian,
Yeah,
isn't he?
Belgium.
Matthias De
Belgium.
Smet. Yeah, yeah. And he's written that wonderful book, which is in my room somewhere here, The Psychology of Totalitarianism. And we have, it started in the schools, very much started in the way schools are now run. And it's global. There's a global campaign, the global education reform movement.
Well, I read a blog the other day that was called something like "Totalitarian Human Beings Come from Totalitarian Classrooms."
Yeah.
And I've read before that to be an autocratic teacher is much easier than being a democratic teacher. Just easier to do, but it doesn't benefit anybody. That's the trouble. What you're saying there, Nigel, it's interesting because I have wondered if education in the schools has deteriorated, but I've taught a lot of new teachers, students who are training to become teachers. And in my book, I put in an account that I had from an American girl, and she wrote this in 2008 because I used to get all my students to keep learner logs. And in this way, they reflected on the lessons, reflected on what they were learning. And it was also an opportunity for them to communicate directly with me. And they would be very surprised when I wrote back and communicated in a two-way flow with each of them. But she wrote this, and to me, this is well, it sums things up. Every day, I would come to class and find myself simply copying from the textbook. During exams, the information that was previously forced down my throat had to be repeated verbatim from the textbook for it to be correct. If I did something wrong, I would get physically punished, stress positions, and various punishments aimed at humiliating the student. Overall, we had to conform to a traditional way of thinking, looking, and talking. I felt that no one had a sense of individuality. Furthermore, I never had the sense that the teachers truly cared about me. Good students would be placed on a golden pedestal, while poor students were continually ridiculed. I had no motivation to learn at all. It's a very sad indictment. Does that? I mean, you know, and I've spoken to so many people from around the world. I think I've taught people from 35 countries, and this story is not confined to one country. It seems to be everywhere. Does that? I know it's the case in the UK. Does that typically describe what happens in Belgium today, Stephen, or?
Well, in my opinion, there is what you were describing was more like the school of our generation, because I feel there is a movement now more from the bottom up, and it started, well, Rudolf Steiner was one of the initiators of this new movement, I think, and also Krishnamurti and other great minds. Also Einstein, when he said imagination is like one of the highest forms of thinking, and you can't solve problems with the same mindset that created the problem. So Einstein was also promoting you don't have to repeat the same textbook with every generation. You have to make the mind evolve and make the solutions come from the minds who came, let's say, to live this solution for the planet. Like you have these two surfers who are now in this organization that wants to clean all the plastic from the ocean, because they were surfing and they were just mad that there was so much plastic in the ocean, but they were not engineers. They were not the ones who studied the plastic problem. They were the ones who were in contact with the ocean and who had a love for life and for surfing and for nature. And from this love for life, they just didn't give up until they got the solution. And I believe, I strongly believe, and I also feel it every time we meet, that from the, let's say, the bottom up people who are in the field, because I strongly believe that a lot of people who enter the educational field, they do it from a kind of calling that they really want to help. They really love being around growing up children, and they really want to support them from their hearts. But then they enter the system where the bureaucracy takes over, and they have to fill in the papers, and they have to check all these boxes of knowledge. and I think they are just drawn into this more paperwork, let's say, with all the rules and the goals to meet. But I generally speak to a lot of adults who train to be a teacher or a mentor or a coach, and I genuinely feel and believe that they really want to do their best and they really want to support children, but the system doesn't allow them to do it the way they would do it if they were more free. And I believe the educational system has done, like, say, a 10% job of what is possible. And it has done a lot of damage. It has done a lot of, like, this programming of the mind that there is only one good answer and the teacher knows the answer and you have to learn this one answer. While what Einstein said, the solution comes from out of the box. It doesn't come from the right answer, because if there is a problem we haven't solved, we should look at it from another perspective or at another way, which also accords with what Nigel said. When you have a problem with two students, if you do it from the textbook of the early ages, you punish them and you give a consequence. And then Nigel said, no, let's take another point of view. Let's take it out of the box. Let's see what happens if we really connect and we really speak to each other from human to human, and what we feel and believe is possible and should be our values. I think we need to evolve more to that kind of life again, which I think was the way of life we led when we still were more in communities, when we lived more in communities and lived closer to each other and more as a group. But in the whole of the system, yeah, that's what I want to say about that.
Nigel?
One of the thoughts I had, slightly off track, but I'll come back to where we were, I hope. I agree with Stephen. I think we are heading towards a beautiful new education system, which is what the Education Charter is all about. But meanwhile, we've got this state globalist education system where the teacher is the all-knowing giver of knowledge to the empty vessels. I mean, it's going back to thoughts from 200 years ago in education. We've kind of come full circle, and it's now that in the modern way, the teacher gives the knowledge to the children. One of the things that we did in our school, and I think I modeled it well, was not knowing the answer. So not knowing the answer, I didn't feign it. I didn't pretend not to know the answer. We would create situations where either there wasn't one answer or I genuinely didn't know. And so the children would say, well, what's the answer? And I say, I don't know. We need to find out. How are we going to find out? How are we going to find out the answer to this maths problem, for example? And the children would then perhaps get together in groups, perhaps do it on their own, because I like children. Some children like to work in groups, some children like to work on their own, and I like to respect that. So they would go off and they would try and solve these problems. And then they would have to teach me how to do it. And then if I thought they'd done it, we would then get them to teach the class how to do it. And everyone would be so thrilled that someone's worked out how to do it. But you have to, it's a lot of it is about ego. And I think in the, I'll call it modern education, the ego of the teacher is paramount, and the teacher must know all the answers. I mean, one of the things I did in both of my schools as the head teacher in England, I think it's true in many countries, where you are called Mr. Utton. So they would call me Mr. Utton, and I changed that. I said, no, I'm Nigel. My name's Nigel. Everyone calls me Nigel, so you call me Nigel as well. And so taking away that hierarchy, and people would criticize me and say, oh, well, the children will have no respect for you. Well, that's absolute nonsense. And they absolutely did have respect for me. And they called me by my name, my first name. And taking away that hierarchy doesn't mean that we were talking about rules earlier on, and the thought I had, because I think all three of us agree that if education is like the flow of water, there needs to be a container. Whoops, is it there? Container that contains that water.
Mm.
Otherwise, it flows everywhere and just makes a mess. So we are there to help contain the education, the thinking that's going on. So rules exist in my head in order to allow that containment for the learning to really fill up and take place, rather than just let everything just be chaotic and not working. So there is an authority in the sense of containment, but not to the extent where at the moment where the containment is like a prison. And I think a lot of children's experience of school at the moment is it's like a prison. They're being imprisoned and having information shoved in their head at the wrong time, in the wrong way, in ways that they can't understand, and often without context. I mean, the worst example I can give, and this was one of the reasons I left education actually, was in England. Reading in English is not a phonetic. Reading is not phonetic. We're not a phonetic language. There are rules that say that you pronounce this letter in this way. But now in English schools, children from the age of 4 upwards are taught phonetic rules. Absolutely crazy. And teachers don't know that you can teach children to read without giving them any phonetic rules at all. I did it. I used to do it all the time. Because as a head teacher, I used to take the children who couldn't read, allegedly, and we would just read. We would read really complex poetry. Gerard Manley Hopkins, The Windhover. I would do that with 8-year-old children who allegedly couldn't read. And by the end of about 10 sessions of half an hour, they could read that poem, but more importantly, they could explain it. They could say what the poem was about. I didn't teach them the letter sounds or all the nonsense that they're taught in schools about bilabial plosives and all this nonsense, which I learned when I was studying phonetics at university. But children are learning that in primary schools now, and it's ludicrous, total waste of their time. What they want is challenging thoughts, challenging stories. Children aren't read stories in primary schools in England anymore. At the end of the day, the teacher used to read to us for half an hour, and it was beautiful. You'd be transformed and transported into this beautiful imaginary world. That's all gone now. You're given a paragraph, and you're only given that paragraph because it has a particular phonetic trick in it that you're supposed to learn. So children, why would they bother learning to read now? Because they're never shown the beauty of a story, the beauty of a poem.
I had one of my students. He said, "You've introduced me to books." He was about 28. He said he'd never read a book. I just want to quickly say to all the viewers, whoever's watching this, Nigel is a loss to the system of education, and he was a head teacher as well. It's always beautiful listening to your thoughts on that. I want to put it to both of you that I think. And I hardly ever hear it discussed anywhere, but I think that the root of the problem in schools is that everybody thinks that education is about transferring knowledge. The focus is on knowledge, which is an object. It's a bit like mainstream medicine. It's the pill, take the pill. It's got nothing to do with the person. So we're going back in the classroom, the focus is on the knowledge. So this is the all-important thing, not you, not the teacher. We don't count. Human beings don't count. This is what you have to get into you, jug and mug. Now, with me and right from the off, because I was told by my first head teacher when I had no clue what to do, he just said to me, Thai students, and these are adult students, only want 2 things. They want to practice speaking English and they want fun. And that was my training. So I took that to heart. Now, what I want to say is that if the teacher or whoever is writing education, anybody in education, a parent at home, anybody that is in a position to help somebody else learn something, if the focus is on the process, the ING, the reading, the listening, the speaking, the articulating yourself, the reflecting of things, the storytelling, all of these things. If we could just focus on learning and understanding, would you agree that the whole, just on that subtle emphasis shift, everything would begin to change from that point? Is that a fair thing to suggest?
I agree. I think it should be more of an adventure and a journey together where we all have different roles. Like for me, I know a lot of math and I can introduce students to some subjects, but in my experience, it only works at its potential if the engagement comes from both sides, not if I have to impose some knowledge, because it is meant to be taught at this very moment. So I agree totally with you, Philip. It should be about the miracle that we are together on a journey.
Yes.
And there is some kind of mystery, even in language. How does it work? Why does this word give you such a feeling? Or why does some word give you a magical feeling, or really a feeling of what it is about? And some other words like two is just a number. It doesn't give you that feeling. So it should be more of the mystery of communication and like stories and poems, and the link with, you can ignite fantasy with words, or you can connect people with words. What communication is really about, I think if we would focus on that, people would want to learn the vocabulary. They would want to translate into other languages. They would like to learn the difference between French and English, or Dutch, or another language, or this sign languages like Chinese or Japanese. They would really get involved from an authentic and adventurous point of view. And I believe that way we really get the real learning aspect. Like when Nigel said, I asked my students, what values do we need? Then the real learning happens, because then they are educating themselves, they are evolving, they are learning to really critical think about things, not because it is a math problem that you need to solve today to get your good points. No, because we understand that critical thinking, it brings about a better environment for everybody. And there is a math teacher, I read a newspaper article, which was in the school I taught 1 year in the Steiner school. And she is one of the highest mathematical professors in the world. She lives in America, I think. But the quote of the article was, let students discuss much more, because that also is mathematics. So she made the link with language and mathematics. It's not you do either language or you do mathematics. No, real conversations is a lot of logical thinking, is a lot of rewiring the brain, is learning to think out of the box. And for me, these kind of statements from these kind of experts, they also reveal that we are about to enter a new era of real education and evolvement, where the real leadership will take its own role and bring forth the fruit it has to bring. Because real leadership, indeed, if you get rid of the blockages, I think you experienced it in your own lessons, Phil, when you focus on the joy and the communication and the real power of language, then you get the magic and the learning power in the students and all that is accompanied with it, like joy and like honoring each other and the respect and the wanting to be in the next lesson. That's where the real life happens for me. So yeah, the shift from the focus that it's about the journey together and about the miracle of evolving and developing and growing together. As Nigel said, the teacher also learns from the student. It's a journey together. I think if we focus on that and on the real purpose of the subject, like I think mathematics is taught totally wrong, because you don't start from a problem a child wants to solve itself. You oppose a problem and it has to solve it. And I think if we look at mathematics, how it is created, how it is still evolving every day, It is because someone chooses to focus on a problem and to solve it. And therefore he needs to invent new mathematics or new thinking. And I think if this is the way mathematics is evolving from itself by humanity, why don't we use the same method in schools and let the students choose their own problems and choose to solve them at the depth they feel they can dive into it, or they are willing to dive into it, and then respect that everybody will be drawn to what he really needs in life. Because I've never seen somebody having to be forced to do mathematics if he was meant to be an engineer or a math professor. The same way with language or other aspects like wood carving. I think if someone is talented for something, the most important thing is to connect him with this world, like wood carving or language or poems or mathematical engineering, or you just have to connect these worlds, and then the learning process will ignite itself. That's what I believe.
I was just thinking, actually, everything we've been saying today actually is the point of the education charter that we've written.
Yeah.
Because the education charter, I mean, the website should be up soon, educationcharter.org. And the idea is to connect people, connect learners and educators together around the world so that we can learn from each other. People, I know they were asking me, well, what's the curriculum going to be with your education charter? I said, there isn't going to be one. Because if the learner is sovereign, you don't need a curriculum. Because I mean, what Stephen was just saying then, if someone is a beautiful wood carver, and I mean, I've been given, a friend of mine, he gave me a wooden spoon that I use in my coffee every morning to serve up my coffee, and he carved this beautiful wooden spoon from an oak tree, and it's got a little oak leaf and a little acorn on the top of the spoon. Now, it must have taken him hours to do that. If he'd been at school, he would have had to done maths now, and then English now, and then geography now, whereas what he needed to do was to sit down and make a spoon. It takes as long as it takes. If it was me, I would get in wood carving experts and show him how to do it, and they can give him the tools and show him how to do that, rather than forcing him to do various different things at different times. He wanted to make a spoon. He's an adult now, so, well, I say he's an adult. He's sort of like, he would have been about 19 when he made that. So it's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And in a school environment, that is not respected usually.
Yeah.
Or the time scale is limited. I remember one occasion when I first became a teacher. This would have been back in the early 1990s. There was a young lad, and we were looking at how you construct a story, and we were reading them stories and looking at different stories, and he started writing a story, and we came back and, does anyone want to read their chapter to the class? And he read his chapter to the class, and everyone said, oh my God, that's amazing, we want to hear more. So for the next 2 weeks, that is all that child did. All he did was write his story. He didn't do any maths, geography, RE, anything. I think he did PE with us, physical education with us, but I think everything else, he just went and wrote his story. And at the end of the day, he'd come and read it to the class. Mm-hmm. Now, he was a young lad who had lost his mother at a very young age. He would have been about 10 then. He'd lost his mother when he was about 6. Mm-hmm. He was a bit of a loner. The other kids didn't really pay much attention to him. And this just made him the most important person in the class. It was transformational to that lad's life. And you wouldn't be allowed to do that in an English school now, because you would have to demonstrate that he was doing 45 minutes of English, 45 minutes of maths. Crazy. It's insanity what we're doing to these young people.
So you've just described the beauty and the tragedy. As you said, Stephen, education can be so joyful, and I know there's lots of your stories like this. You know, maybe I need a 10-hour chat, but what you said there, Stephen, that, you know, it's a journey, and when I wrote in my book, I said, is life a journey or a destination? And it's the same in the classroom. So if everybody involved in education, which, as we've discussed in our education meetings, it doesn't just mean teachers, it's parents, it's anybody where learning is taking place. And once we learn how to learn, we actually become lifelong learners. So we are educating ourselves, being educated, educating others every single day of our life until the final day. So life is a journey. And when we think it's a destination, well, that is at the end of our life, that's death. So in effect, if we're always trying to get somewhere, we miss the journey. Whereas if we focus on the journey, which comes back to the ING, you know, the learning, the reading, the talking, the communicating, that is the journey. That's the emphasis. That's where the joy happens. And as you say there, Nigel, that's when, or was it you, Stephen? That's when people want to come back to the next lesson. They don't want to leave. They don't want to leave. And then I've calculated, I think, roughly speaking, children get 14,000 hours of classroom time. Just imagine if the focus was on the ING and not the so-called knowledge, it would transformational. So yeah, it's tragic where we are in the mainstream and in the status quo. But as we've all discovered, chatted together, and what you've said today, Stephen, we are rebuilding education, and so much good stuff's coming out. I'm mindful that we've had about an hour. I'm just wondering if both of you, if we could end where for all the viewers and the listeners, what tip would you give a parent or a teacher or anybody that works with children, or even in, you know, as a manager with fellow adults? What tip would you give them to improve the relationships within that group?
I used to give a very cheeky talk because I was considered a behaviour expert on children's behaviour, but this is for learning as well. And I said there are 3 very simple rules for children's behaviour. Number 1 is ask the child. Number 2 is ask the child. Number 3 is ask the child. And if you haven't learnt it by then, just ask the child, please. They know what they want. They know how they need to do it. There are tricks that we can teach them. There are learning tools that we can teach them. But if you ask them what they want to do, what they want to learn, and then facilitate that learning, that's for me.
Brilliant.
That's number 1.
Brilliant tip. And it makes it so much easier for the teacher because it takes the workload off us. Puts the learning and responsibility with the children. Lovely tip. And I did teach. Always taught my teacher students the art of asking questions and questioning your own answers. And it's fantastic. Yeah, I love that tip. Stephen, what about your tip for all the viewers to finish us off?
Well, I take it from another perspective, where I think life is about growing as an individual, but also growing as a member of a group. And for me, Nigel really explained how will you get the child to learn very motivated and from inside out. And I think there is also another aspect where we have to learn how to be human together, how to build a society together. And therefore we need the clear rules. So we need a clear environment where everybody knows this is the setting, this is how we enter this place, room, or institute. But they should serve the evolvement of every individual. Every individual should be honored and lifted to another level of being by this clear set of agreements, values, rules, how you want to call it, which you decide together. And I think if you have these both, you get a very rich environment.
Fantastic. I better offer mine. Which one would I offer? Quite often I would be in the teacher's room at the university, and an old student teacher from 4, 5, 6 years ago would turn up, and then they'd always like to tell you their story of what they remembered in my classroom. And one of our classes, well, more than one, where we focus specifically on motivation and the role of the teacher in the motivational aspect of teaching. And I said, look, basically motivation comes down to 2 things. You either use the carrot or you use the stick. So that is motivation, carrot or stick. And he was telling me the story, and I couldn't remember it. And he said that he asked me the question. He said, Philip, what happens if the carrot doesn't work? And apparently my answer was, go and get another carrot. So I thought, oh, I quite like that answer. In other words, forget the stick, get rid of it. And every story that you ever tell of your time, Nigel, there's no sticks there. There's just rules and the container. I love that as well about the water. The water in a puddle isn't much use, but in a container is perfect. Look, I have to thank you both very much for being my first guests. I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to you both, and we always have good discussions in another context. So it was really good of you to give your time to come on my first podcast.
Absolute pleasure, and good luck with them, Phil. Really looking forward to seeing them.
Thank you. Well,
Yes.
thank you, Stephen. Sorry.
Congratulations with your initiative, Philip, and with your courage to do this.
Thank you.
And I was honored to be one of the first.
Well, it was
Great
to get you both. Just stick around for 1 minute when I press the thing. But what was I going to say? It's gone, so I won't say it. Thank you very much. Obviously, I'll see you in a week or so. And to everybody out there watching, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion on education. We didn't really hit the spirituality, but I think you probably got a good sense of what spiritual living is with this discussion about, what makes for good education. So many thanks to Nigel and Stephen, and I will be back another time. Goodbye.